Back live on Huskers Hoops Live. Jake Schrantz, your host all season long. And right now, we have got Jacob Padilla joining us from Hail Varsity on the show yet again. Jacob, it's great to have you back on the show.
Yeah, I wish things were going a little bit better for the team for us to discuss, but thanks for having me back.
So, first thing to start with, I want to start with this Illinois game because Nebraska was coming off an inspiring kind of overtime victory over Minnesota on the road. So, how are you feeling going into that game, especially as this would end up being the healthiest that the lineup that Nebraska would be putting out there all week?
Yeah, I didn't feel great coming off of that Minnesota loss, just considering how they barely scraped by, and they need to get to overtime against the worst team in the conference. They only scored 67 points in regulation, so the 81 is a lot of that happened in overtime. So it wasn't like they had a great offensive game either. So it's just kind of as more and more conference games started to stack up, and they struggled to put points on the board. They still haven't hit 70 yet in a regulation Big Ten game. So didn't feel great. Illinois wasn't having a great season, but they certainly had some talented pieces. So thought it was an opportunity for Nebraska, but it wasn't something like, I was going in feeling super confident about their chances, and hung around for a while, but then that kind of run to end the first half put them in trouble, and they weren't able to dig out of it in the second half.
Yeah, I definitely agree there. The offense was and has been really the issue in conference play this year, but Nebraska got lit up by yet another wing player in Terrence Shannon Jr., and this is kind of a continued pattern for Nebraska struggling to handle these top offensive options on the wing. You know, Keontae Johnson had a big game himself against Nebraska as well earlier this year, obviously one of the better wing players in the Big 12 at Kansas State. So was this surprising to you? Because the Huskers usually bring that high-level defensive intensity to each game, and when you look at the way they match up with teams, they actually have some pretty impressive length on the wings. I mean, with the likes of Sam Griesel, Jamarcus Lawrence, and even Juwan Gary.
Yes, Emmanuel Banamel was the player that talked with us before the game, and he mentioned how Shannon, he thought he was as good of a two-way player as they'd seen up to that point, and was looking forward to kind of testing himself against him and seeing where he stood as a defender. And then Banamel picked up 2 fouls in the first half, only played 10 minutes, and Shannon went on to score 25 points. And for our podcast, Nebraska Shoot-Around, my buddy Jacob Bigelow, I went through and kind of broke down all his buckets, and he basically scored on the entire team. Like, he 5 points on this guy, 4 points on this guy, 5 points on that guy. Like, there wasn't one guy that he took advantage of. He just scored on everybody, and it was a combination of mistakes and just not being fast enough. Like, that's the thing. Like, most of his damage was done just exploding to the rim, and that's kind of where Nebraska struggles with lateral quickness. They've got Banamel does a good job at times, but he can still get caught flat-footed, and that's the one bucket that he gave up to Shannon, where it's kind of off a scramble situation, and then Banamel relaxed just a little bit, and Shannon took advantage and blew right by him. And that's a bunch of his buckets were just getting past guys that couldn't stay in front of him. And so that's kind of where this team is susceptible in terms of one-on-one play and taking advantage of that length and getting to the rim, because you've got Sam Griesel, C.J. Wilcher, Keisei Tominaga. These guys aren't the fleetest of foot. And then, again, even Banamel and Juwan Gary are more physical types as opposed to, like, super quick and stay in front of anybody type of defenders. So it's kind of what I saw there in terms of how Shannon was able to take advantage of Nebraska's defense.
And like you said, he scored on pretty much the entire team. He's really good at slashing to the basket. And of all the transfers that came into the Big Ten Conference coming up this year, Terrence Shannon was definitely number one in all of them, in my opinion, as really just the biggest problem that teams were going to have to deal with. Obviously, he had some highs and lows at Texas Tech, but I would imagine you also thought he was probably the best offensive talent coming in to the Big Ten Conference this year as all the transfers.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of teams that benefit from transfers, like Illinois is right at the top with Dane Danger as well being a problem down low, and Matthew Meyer inconsistent, but when he's hitting, he's tough. Yeah, Shannon was definitely one up there. And again, if you're looking at teams that were going to benefit most from transfers, it was definitely them. Dawson Garcia is another one that is having a good season for Minnesota. Not that it's leading to a lot of results, but that's the guy you said, if he could kind of rediscover where he was coming into college after kind of a weird year with North Carolina last year, going back home to Minnesota. He's another guy, like I said. Danger is a guy that's really come alive. Jameer Young at Maryland is another one who's having a great year for them. But yeah, I think Shannon is right up there towards in terms of both kind of expectations and performance at this point as far as transfers go.
And the final score doesn't really display this too much, as this ended up being kind of a blowout by the end of the game. But heading into the halftime locker room, Nebraska was still very much in reach of, they only needed a little bit of a second half run to start things off to really pull themselves back into this game. But they gave up 42 points to Illinois in the final 20 minutes. And, of course, we can't forget about that 50 points allowed to St. John's in their own second half. So when these second half collapses start to happen, what do you think Nebraska needs to do in order to slow down some of these runs from their opponent? Is it maybe taking more timeouts to calm things down? Is it maybe a certain offensive set that you like from Big Red that can maybe get them back into a rhythm? What do you think it is?
Yeah, that's a tough thing for Fred Hoiberg to have to find out or figure out, and I guess that's why he makes the big bucks there. But because I don't know if there is one thing that they can do, and like you said, they scored the 3 quick buckets to start second half, got that thing down to 5 right away after going into halftime down 11-0, or down 11. But they just couldn't sustain it. Things just kind of it's tough when you go through these scoring droughts, and when teams can take advantage of that and go score the other way, especially off of rebounds, off of turnovers. Nebraska's one of the worst in the country, unfortunately, in live ball turnovers. Their turnover rate overall is pretty average, but when they turn over, it tends to be one that can fuel a fast break the other way. So they got to find a way to score. Like it's as simple as that. Defensively, they're good. They compete, but they're not elite. Like they still make their fair share of mistakes. And I kind of highlighted a lot of those that Minnesota game that kept that game closer than it should have been. So it's not a team that's going to be able to play 20, 40 straight minutes of lockdown defense and win a game in the 50s or low 60s more often than not against a talented team. We've got to find a way, and I don't know what that way is at this point, especially with Juwan Gary being out. Like losing him with 2 minutes to go in the half, that's huge for this team. He wasn't a great offensive player, but he was a guy that can put the ball in the basket, at least on some cuts to the basket. The occasional jumper, even if the percentages aren't good. The 9.5 points, 6.5 rebounds out of your lineup, big piece of your defense as well. So losing him, like Wilhelm Breinbach stepped up, had that personal 11-2 run there to get that thing back down to 11, and then Derek Walker at the end wanted to make it a 10-point game. And then again, the offense just deserted them, and they scored 1 point the rest of the way. So it really is coming down to just finding ways to sustain offense, to settle down, to go get an easy bucket, to get an open look and knock it down. because that's kind of what happens is these things tend to snowball where they get into a rut offensively and bad shot, run back the other way, and turnover, run back the other way, or get an opportunity to with a good look and just can't make it, whether a kick out, open three, or a drive to the rim contested that you weren't able to finish. It's just kind of all those things pile up there, and suddenly you go on another one of those scoring droughts, and you look up and the team scored almost every single time, and now you're down 15-20 again.
And I'm glad you talked about the importance of Juwan Gary to this team and how tough it's going to be while he is out, because recently people have been loving on Wilhelm Breidenbach a lot, and for good reason. I mean, he's been playing some of his best basketball of his college career over the past few weeks or so, but people have to remember that Juwan Gary was starting over Wilhelm Breidenbach for pretty much the entire regular season, and the reason being is that he's still able to keep defenses honest on the perimeter in a similar way that Wilhelm is, even though obviously I would say Wilhelm is a bit of a better perimeter shooter than Juwan Gary, but he also brings that elevated defense that Wilhelm so far hasn't been able to bring in the same way. So how do you think Juwan Gary being out will continue to impact this team moving forward? Obviously, the Purdue game happening didn't look great defensively, but we move forward into some of these games coming up, like Ohio State, one of the better offenses in the country as well.
Yeah, that's kind of well, the decision was taken out of his hands going into the game because of the Sam Griesel missing as well. So he ended up starting both Denham Dawson and Wilhelm Breidenbach. That was kind of what Hoiberg said was the decision going into the game. It'll be one of those two. He kind of liked what Breidenbach brings as that first big off the bench at either the 5 or the 4. Completely different player, skill set, body type from Gary at the 4. Breidenbach's more traditional, 6'10", big guy. Obviously, got a little bit more skill, but can play the 4 or the 5. But Denham Dawson is a guy that kind of most closely replicates what Gary brings, but at this point, he's just not really ready to produce offensively in the Big Ten. Just struggling to get the ball to go in the basket on any type of shots, honestly. So that's, I mean, he started those two guys with Griesel and Gary out, and they combined for 0 points on 9 shot attempts. So that's just not going to get it done. Like, they're going to need more production out of those two in particular, because those are the guys that are going to be filling the void for Gary. And Hoiberg said it's going to be a long-term deal. Like, he doesn't know when he's going to be back. Hoping to get him back this regular season, but don't know when that might be. So they're going to have to make do, find a way to stay afloat without Gary, and a lot of it comes down to those guys, because those are the ones who are going to see their minutes expanded most.
And you talked about guys struggling to score in the Big Ten, and Denham Dawson, obviously a very young player, but someone that I don't think has that excuse really anymore is C.J. Wilcher. I mean, it's his second year in the system. He's known as a three-point shooter and a scorer here at Nebraska, but against Purdue recently, he had his 12th game of single-digit scoring this season, as he had just 2 points on 4 shot attempts. So why is he in a game where Sam Griesel is out, Juwan Gary's out? I would have personally thought this would be the game that C.J. Wilcher kind of arrives at Nebraska. He's got the green light to just put up shots. I mean, you're already going into a game against Purdue where no one's really giving you a shot, missing 2 starters. I would have thought that this would be the game where Wilcher's putting up 15, 20 shots to try to just get hot in this game and carry your team to a victory. Where was that?
Yeah, he's probably one of the most disappointing parts of the season to this point. That you were hoping to see him take a step forward, second year in the conference. Obviously, Hoiberg raved about the conditioning work he did in the offseason, transform his body and make him a little bit quicker, which hopefully help him on both ends. But it just hasn't really translated to the games. He still just slow-footed, and teams know that. Like, he's one of the Tominaga and Wilcher are the two guys on the perimeter that you don't want to leave open there, and they're struggling to get open with the sets that Nebraska runs and the actions. Like, you don't often find Wilcher with a ton of space. He just doesn't create separation. And so a lot of three-point looks he gets aren't easiest. And when he does get open looks, he's not hitting them at a high enough rate right now. He's shooting 31% from three overall. And he's tried to go to the basket more and find other ways to score, but that's just not his game. Like, he's done a little bit of it, but it's not at a high enough rate to be really impactful. Shooting under 46% inside the arc, and shooting 38% overall, under 9 points a game in almost 30 minutes a game. So that's, I mean, between Wilcher and Vandemel just not being able to hit shots, that's, I think, a big part of Nebraska's offensive struggles right there, considering how, I mean, limited they are in terms of offensive options. Having those two guys that play 30 minutes a game between them, shooting that poorly while leading the team in three-point attempts, that's just it's just not going to work out for them. They've got to find a way to get better play out of those guys. But this late in the season, when halfway through, you just kind of don't feel confident that it's going to happen.
And one of the brighter spots, I would say, of this past week has been Jamarques Lawrence. You know, limited production, but still some of the better basketball that he's been playing so far and early in his college career. He had 6 points versus Purdue, a three-pointer versus Illinois in the game before that. So after watching some of these recent games, I've picked out, I believe, 3 guys on this current roster right now that I believe could be future building blocks for this program. I'm looking at Denham Dawson, Jamarques Lawrence, and Wilhelm Breidenbach. Do you agree with my list? Are there any guys you would remove or add to the list? What do you think about that?
The problem is right now, I don't know if any of those guys would qualify for that in terms of what they've shown to this point. Guys that you'd feel great, like, all right, next year these guys are going to be able to step into this elevated role. I mean, you look at the team, and four of the 5 best players on the team, 4 of the 5 leading scorers, are 3 of the 5 rather are super seniors that aren't going to be here next year, no matter what. With Derek Walker and Sam Griesel are the unquestioned best players on the team, and then Juwan Gary or Manu Vandemel rather for what he does defensively. Gonna find a way to replace all those guys, and right now all these guys are struggling as role players to produce consistently. You mentioned Breidenbach kind of had that nice little streak there. He's averaging almost 8 points a game over with 3 double-digit games in his last 6, and then the Purdue game happened, and just fouls and wasn't making anything and forcing shots up and went 0 for 6 from the field. So you thought maybe he was turning a corner, and then he falls right back into having a really bad game when the team couldn't afford it. So I don't know if there is, and that's kind of, I wrote about this a little bit. That's kind of, they're in a tough spot as a program right now. Like, finally in year 4, Hoiberg changed the kind of the identity of the team, the kind of the playing style, the emphasis, and it's showing progress, but I don't know how much of that is sustainable as like something you can really build the program around. Like, they need to get more talent into this program at this point. It's not like they're lighting up the recruiting ranks at this point. They've got one commit that just missed out on, lost the recruiting battle to Rutgers about a guy that I think they felt pretty good about at one point. And so, like, they're gonna to be able to kind of carry whatever momentum they built this season forward, and they still have to play the second half of the season and find a way for things not to spiral out of control, especially with Gary out. But they're going to have to hit really big in the transfer portal again, because I don't see any of these guys coming back next year as guys that are ready to step up and be a 1, 2, or maybe even third option offensively. Just with the way that Wiltshire is kind of disappointed and how inconsistent Breitenbach has been. I really don't know who those guys are next year.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you in that all three of them are still incredibly raw so far, but to me, I see them, maybe one or two facets away from being some pretty special players. I look at a guy like Jamarcus Lawrence. If he starts to be able to add a little bit of playmaking to his game off the dribble, and maybe, let's say, that three-point shot becomes a little bit more consistent throughout the rest of the season, I see him being a guy maybe similar to like a Johnny Davis for Wisconsin last year. But we'll move on from there, as I want to get into this Ohio State game coming up. Obviously, Bryce Sensabaugh coming to town, one of the brightest freshmen in the conference and really the whole nation, alongside Bruce Thornton, who has been solid as well. They both make good plays on the perimeter, something that Nebraska has struggled to defend really more than anything this season, dribble drive, stuff like that. How do you think Nebraska will be able to handle yet another freshman wing scorer from Ohio State? Obviously, we remember how much Malachi Branham was able to get off against this Nebraska team last year.
Yeah, and that's, again, losing Gary, he'd be the guy that would match up with Sensabaugh because he's built pretty similar. He's 6'6", 235, like strong, compact dude, almost 17 a game, can really shoot the ball off the dribble, mid-range from three. He's not a guy that generates a ton of easy looks in general, but he's a tough shot maker. And he's just continued to hit those shots all season long. So that's it would be curious to see. Hopefully Sam Griesel's back, and then Hoiberg will have to make that decision in terms of, all right, who starts at the 4. I wonder if you just start with Denham Dawson and try to hope that he can chase him around and do whatever he can to slow him down, because they don't have a ton of great options in terms of matchups. But we'll see. Maybe Banamel tries to, you give him stints trying to guard up a little bit without, because they don't really have a really dynamic guard in the backcourt. Sean McNeil is more of a shooter than a creator. Bruce Thornton isn't a huge threat offensively. Another freshman, almost 10 points a game, but isn't great inside the arc. So there isn't necessarily that guy that you need Bandamel to chase around. So that could be an option to put him on Sensabaugh. Either that or you put him on Justice Sewing as another their other leading scorer. Almost 14 a game, kind of a long, lanky wing. He missed last season mostly because of injuries, but he's been healthy this year and having a good year for them, even if he's not shooting the ball super great. So those are kind of the options that Hoiberg's going to have to sort through with Gary out of the lineup. But yeah, it's a team that they hit the slump recently, obviously, with 4 straight losses. It's still, despite that, they're still 4th in adjusted offensive efficiency on KenPom, even though they've only the top 70 once during this 4-game losing streak. So hopefully Nebraska saw something in the film that they can take advantage of and kind of hang around and find a way to scrap to enough points to make this a competitive game and potentially pull one out.
And if, like you said, if they keep Denham Dawson out there with potentially Sam Griesel coming back, that would be yet another new lineup that Nebraska throws out there. Obviously, early in the season, we saw Blaze Keita in the lineup for Derek Walker. We've seen Keisei Tominaga in there at different times for Sam Griesel. We saw Denham Dawson in there for Sam Griesel versus Purdue. All of these new lineups kind of working together to scramble to put out a 5-man out there to start games. But, Jacob, we are wrapping things up here on the show. Thank you again for joining and giving us your insight.
Yeah, hopefully they can figure some things out, and we'll have a little bit better basketball to discuss next time.
Most definitely. Thank you again, and have a good one.
You too.
That was Jacob Padilla of Hail Varsity joining the show. Always awesome to talk to him. He gets a lot of insight on this Nebraska team, and he's just really fun to talk to and gives some good stuff. But let's wrap things up on Huskers Hoops Live, giving a little bit of a preview. Don't have too much time left, just under 60 seconds to go. But the women's team takes on Purdue on the road tomorrow at 6 p.m. Central Time on Big Ten Plus. They are 12-5 on the year, led by Lasha Petri, who's averaging 16 points per game on the dot. So the women's team will have some road game action tomorrow to tune into. At the same time that the men's team is taking on Ohio State live from Pinnacle Bank Arena, 6 p.m. Central Time. So may have to double screen that if you're watching at home. But thank you all again for tuning in to another edition of Huskers Hoops Live on KRNU. Make sure you tune in next week, 8 a.m. Central Time, as always. And with that being said, go Big Red.